presentation of the night. And thank you everyone for hanging out. And we will take some time for more just kind of discussion and question afterwards. But Abayomi, you're up next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of our conference today. My name is Abayomi, and my project is called Capitalism and the Specter of Bohemia, a changing landscape for artists and art educators. Before I get into the meat of my topic, I just wanted to talk to you all a little bit about how I came upon my research topic. Last semester, in another one of Jess's amazing classes, I worked on a paper in which I explored the relationship between artists and mental health. As I wrote that project, I realized that two of the biggest factors that kept coming up were art education and finances. So delving deeper and moving forward with this project, I wanted to learn more about the relationship between art and money, and I ended up realizing that capitalism is the catalyst for problems both in art education and for professional artists. First, let's talk about art education. There are two things that I want to cover here. One is how art education is affected by capitalism. Number two is the experience of art students both at the primary and secondary level and at the college level. So there are two powerful and destructive ways in which capitalism affects art education. One is that students don't have access to the same level and quality of art education based on their class and their race. And two is that a lot of schools across our nation are struggling for funding. We also struggle with a nationwide culture of art not being seen as worthy of time, attention, or money. And I think that manifests in some of the attitudes that our teachers pass down to our students about art. And that's exemplified here in the first quote that you see, which I'll read for you. I think that my projects in art classes are sometimes deemed less important, and some of my academic teachers don't recognize that as a crucial way for me to spend my time. This quote is a great example of how capitalistic attitudes towards art in the classroom environment can actually destroy the future potential and projects that a student could do in the future. Creative students who do want to pursue their passion professionally oftentimes are going to go to art college. And the problem with art college is that many times students aren't receiving the financial and economic knowledge that they need in order to not only survive, but hopefully thrive in their creative careers. And then you're adding on top of that what we just discussed, which is our overall societal attitude towards art as having no value. And I think the second quote really exemplifies that issue. So I'll read that for you. In fashion, there are really only two options for your career. You either work commercially or you start your own line. No one in my graduating class at Moore or the class before was successful at having their own business. I think what we've discussed in this slide is going to move us nicely into our next topic, which is the political economy of art. What I really want you to take away from this slide is the dichotomy between how we talk about art and artists and how we actually show what we think about art and artists through how we support them, right? So on the left, we have a quote from Richard Nixon, and I'll read that now. The excellence of American product in the arts has won worldwide recognition. The arts have the rare capacity to help heal divisions among our people and to vault some of the barriers that divide our world. And then that is a quote that I'm sure a lot of you were not expecting to come from Richard Nixon, but surprisingly, he was the president who actually allocated the most funds towards artists and artwork in American history. I think it's funny to take a quote like that with an image that was obviously created by an artist on the right, showing us the position of the artist in America, right? So if Richard Nixon was right and art can do all of those things for us, why is it that artists are creating images like the one on the right? There was another era in American history in which the arts thrived, and that was during the New Deal. The New Deal Arts Project provided work for jobless artists, but they also had a larger mission: to promote American art and culture and to give Americans access to what President Franklin Roosevelt described as an abundant life. So I think the New Deal and Nixon's funding of the arts, it gives us a little bit of a picture of what the future could be like for artists and public art if the government took a more active role in supporting creative work. Next, I want to get us familiar with the history of Bohemia, what it is, and how I'm going to be redefining that for my project. So the French poet Victor Hugo created what he called the Romantic Army, which was a group of artists who, like him, were fed up with the patronage system of the arts, and they decided to take their power into their own hands, and they started protesting the patronage system. Hugo and his friends started to be known throughout France for being an eclectic and creative group of artists who were striving for freedom. The Romani people also had a community in France, and of course this was before the discovery that the Romani people are originally from India. So the French thought that the Romani people were from a country called Bohemia. So that's how we get the phrase Bohemian. Anti-establishment or counterculture communities in France were being called Bohemians, whether or not they were a Romani people. So that also included artists. And that is kind of how we got to our modern interpretation of Bohemia or Bohemianism, which is hippies, basically. I think that a new definition of Bohemia can include free art and experiences for an abundant life, free education and removing the problem of funding for schools, putting power back in the hands of communities, and freedom from economic stresses, especially for me, including free mental health care. Essentially, I think that Bohemia should be a people-first and community-centered approach to designing modern life and the systems and institutions that sustain it. So Bohemia has been defined by artistic freedom, by anti-establishment values and a rejection of money, and finally, those values have converged. So I talked about how for our purposes and the themes of this research, I'm going to be redefining Bohemia. And that may seem like kind of a big idea, but Bohemia is already something that has ebbed and flowed and changed throughout history. And I think, as we'll talk about later on, we're currently seeing another change in Bohemia. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Bohemia's history through the years, specifically in America. First, we have the Beat Generation, which was in the 50s, and they were largely a literary movement. Because they weren't terribly counterculture and were more interested in a proliferation of the arts, and also because they were most visibly white, the Beat Generation didn't encounter the same kind of violent crackdown that the hippie movement would in the 60s and 70s. The hippies were positioning substances as something that could change the nationwide view towards establishments. And going back to the title of my project, Capitalism and the Spectre of Bohemia, that's exactly why the powers that be cracked down on substances and we had the war on drugs. So we can see that the Bohemian movement is something that establishments are aware of and don't want to move forward. Now, both of these examples are a little bit aged, and I want to talk about some recent examples of how Bohemia is resurfacing in our modern culture. And I think an amazing example of that is Occupy Wall Street. So that was during 2011, and I'm sure everyone remembers the financial collapse of 2008 that led to it. And it's interesting because I think Occupy Wall Street, you really start to see the convergence of social justice and bohemianism. So I think that Occupy Wall Street really took some bohemian values mainstream, and we started to see a more widespread disdain for money, the problems it causes, and the people and institutions that hoard it. I think in a lot of ways, Occupy Wall Street led to what we saw this past summer in Seattle, Washington with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I think that this event really exemplifies a coming together of the worlds of social justice and Bohemia. So that is kind of how Bohemian values are moving into the future by merging with social justice, which is something that is on the minds of a lot of Americans right now. And I want to read this great quote for you from a Portland protester who was at the Autonomous Zone. There was a food co-op, there were classes, lectures, speakers, poetry, lots of live music, huge works of art. It was really beautiful. And while the focus of the Autonomous Zone and the protests may have been social justice, I think the proliferation of arts within the Autonomous Zone really spells out for us that Bohemian values are still here and still strong. And they're a part of the way that we are trying to shape the future for artists and educators. So I hope that I've been able to clearly illustrate to you all the modern convergence of social justice and Bohemia and how they relate to each other and what we've been discussing. And I think that a great example of all of those ideas is the Abolitionist Teaching Network. And I just want to read for you the first part of the blurb that I put here. Abolitionist Teaching's network mission is simple: develop and support educators to fight injustice within their schools and communities. I think that injustice includes the monetary injustices that our students face and that our underpaid teachers face and that professional artists face. I also think that the addressing of these issues over time will lead to a better social standing for artists and art. In conclusion, I want to address implementation of these ideas that we've been talking about. Although I would love to be able to put my creative work into the world without needing payment for it, we are still operating under a system in which we need money to survive. So for my personal creative practice, in order to further remove myself from the need to be employed, I'm looking into more community-oriented methods to receive payment for my work. I'm also looking for ways to work with other artists and groups in a community so that we can make more projects with less cost. And I'm looking at alternatives to the normal school system, environments in which I can provide students with the best possible materials and content and not have to worry about tenure or funding or which students aren't going to have access to what I'm giving them when they move away from class. So finally, I just wanted to share a few questions for you all that I think could be useful for all of us to start thinking about, especially in this huge time of change that 2020 has been and that I'm sure 2021 will continue to be. And those questions are, 1, how can we incorporate Bohemian values and social justice into the creative and educational work we do? 2, how can we move power away from institutions and towards communities and people? And 3, how can we restructure life in ways that free the public to pursue their passion projects? Thank you all for watching my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Abayomi. And wow, wow, wow. Like, that was incredible. And again, just this education that, like, again, I feel just so, I feel so privileged to be able to learn from all of you guys, because just these ways that you guys are taking your perspectives and putting them all together, and just like, especially the way that you're weaving in with the Occupy Wall Street and the, like, this idea of Bohemia going forward. Like, I'm gonna tell you, that is not lost on me. And this whole mindset, I'm gonna just keep pushing to all of my channels that I might have, right? I'm just like, yes, yes, this is how we do this. Fills in a lot of gaps for me, let's say. So wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So I want